Ladies and gentlemen, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're based. Today with us we have Hesham Shafick, who holds a PhD and MPP with over 10 years of experience in the policy segment. Um, Hesham has been a professor awarded the Doctors of Philosophy and PhD in Political Science from Queen Mary University of London, has a Masters of Science Public Policy from UCL. He also studied at the George Washington University his BA in Development Economics and International Development, as well as a BA at the American University of Cairo in Political Science and Economics. I'll give you some further details about his experience once he's joined, but just as a brief overview, amongst the many things he has done is he has been the assistant to the spokesperson at the presidency of the Arab Republic of Egypt, a research assistant for the Constitution Unit at UCL, an assistant lecturer at the British University in Egypt, a teaching fellow at Queen Mary University of London, a teaching fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Science, a teaching fellow at SOAS, a director of public affairs at Moharam and Partners, a policy advisor for the German government, a professor of political economy at the United Nations Institute of Training and Research, an assistant professor of strategic management at the German International University, and policy sustainability and GA lead for AstraZeneca. He should be joining us shortly. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, Hesham, thank you for joining. Today's guest is someone who has mastered the rare art of bridging worlds. Governments, classrooms of top universities, advising public policy to shaping corporate sustainability strategies. And that man's name is Dr. Hesham Shafick. Hesham is currently the Policy, Sustainability, and Government Affairs lead at AstraZeneca, an assistant professor of strategic management at the German International University, and an adjunct professor of political economy with the United Nations Institute for Training and Research. I've personally had your class. Hesham has advised on Middle East politics and has taught in some of the world's most respected institutions, including LSE, SOAS, Queen Mary University of London, and a jack of all trades, as I like to call him. He brings a unique blend of academic depth, policy insight, and real world impact. So, Hesham, welcome to the show, and glad to have you here.
Thank you very much, Alex. I mean, quite humbled by your introduction and looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. So I think from the get-go, one of my first questions to you is you've moved from between academia, public policy, and the private sector. So what's that change like? What's the biggest mindset shift required from moving to teaching young university students to corporate boardrooms? How do you handle that?
Well, I would think of it as extensions of one another. It's quite common today in the medical society, for instance, that the physician would be at the university in the morning and then at night at the clinic. Um, Things are a bit different when it comes to social sciences, but I think, given and especially after a series of economic crises that hit the world, economic and policy crises that hit the world, the need for this kind of academic practitioners, or I would call it scholarly activists, right? Activists in the sense of activating the markets, and scholarly in the sense of being still there at universities, not only teaching but more importantly learning and researching. And I think there are more and more of this kind of personas that are coming up in the coming generations, where you would have to wear the two hats of scholarship and practice when it comes to economic and public policy.
On that note, I was actually in another conversation, and the gentleman there told me that the world would be a better place if you had more scholars, more political scientists. He said, and people with PhDs in general, active in public policy. So you don't separate and focus just on the theoretical part, but you implement the theory into practice, and that could potentially shift all the past tragedies that we have seen in the global scale into something more efficient. What do you think of that?
Well, honestly, I think there is some sort of, how I put it, um, I wouldn't say stigma, but a stereotype about academia that it is, there is theory and then there's practice. But theory has forever been embedded in practice. And perhaps with the boom of technology and the quick transfer of knowledge and quick transfer of also industrial insights, this kind of distinction is more and more fading away. Theory is embedded in practice, practice as well is embedded in concepts, right? We think through theory and we act through theory, whether boardrooms, in universities, or in in governments, in whatever organizations and whatever dialogues we set in. So this distinction from the beginning wasn't that, fine lined, and perhaps with the advancement of technology and the quick transfer of knowledge and insights, this is even, the space is even getting more and more closer. And that's why, of course, this kind of linkage between scholarship and practice is not only more needed than before, but also easier to access, much easier to access than before.
That's an interesting perspective. Let me ask you this: from the positions you've had, which role has challenged your worldview the most, and why?
Now, that's a very tough question. I mean, definitely what challenges you the most is undergraduate teaching. The undergrads are usually very young, and the the older I get, the more challenging it becomes to set foot within the new generation's understanding of the world. I think this is the most challenging, and this is the most exciting as well, because you get to stay young forever, right? Because you're always
I agree.
dealing with young scholars with new insights about the world.
Are they more, I'm not going to say arrogant, but are they more spearheaded than the previous generations? Or do you think it's just you or or older academics growing older that sort of sees it as more arrogant? No offense.
I mean, absolutely. It just makes sense for them, for this generation, to be a little bit more, I wouldn't say arrogant, but more confident.
Mm.
The opportunities are plenty. The students today, they sit in your economics class and they know that, they can end up as influential TikTokers rather than, rather than losing their lives within the books as we did. So there is this understanding of the sky's the limit. There are plenty of opportunities out there, and this is making this generation, whether in the university or in the workplace, quite confident, quite they wouldn't take any nonsense. They wouldn't accept any nonsense, and this is something I think is a good development within this generation. I really encourage that, and I really think that the power dynamics in a few years, when this generation takes over the power dynamics, the traditional capitalist power dynamics between the authority, whether it's the boardroom or the university professor, and the agency is also getting quite disturbed, and this is something that we should endorse, honestly.
I agree with you. I mean, initially when I was leading teams and you got the first batch of Gen Zers coming in, their whole attitude was something that was very controversial to what I was used to. But seeing how they act and how they push back into things like authority or boardrooms, I tend to agree with what you say, and I think it will actually reshape all industries, all policy making, all potential politics. Generally, the social contract that we have as a society in each society will completely change with this generation. Now, I'm being very optimistic about it. I just wanted to sort of see how you feel.
Same here.
Okay, cool. Let me shift a little bit into the Middle East then. You have taught and worked extensively on Middle Eastern politics. The traditional question is, what's one narrative about the region that the West consistently gets wrong?
The I mean, the first one is the Middle East. It's the definition itself, right? Like
Fair enough.
on one instance, it's very hard for me to speak about Europe as one single unitary
Mm.
block, right? And then the idea of a Middle East, when you just challenge yourself and say middle of who, right, and east of what, and then you start realizing that we're talking about London, right? We're seeing the world from from a UK based view, right? It's the east of London, it's the east of the empire, and it's the middle out there. If I go to Europe and I start talking about the the West, the Middle West, right? Uh, Everybody will laugh. If I talk about the Far West as the United States, everybody will laugh. But when I say Middle East, nobody laughs, which also means that we're still thinking of the world in this traditional colonial psychospico kind of distinction, and this is having lots of implications that are not only political. It's having implications on social stigmas. It's having implications on approaches to the economy, approaching Egypt as a 106 million people economy in comparison to Qatar, for instance, or in comparison to other countries that are Tunisia, for instance, that are very different. Looking at the Egyptian culture in parallels with Algeria, well, I know we're both seen as Middle Easterns or seen as Arabs, but there are very different,
Huge.
and there are very plenty of nuances that we don't see. So I would say the main thing the West gets wrong is thinking of the Middle East as a Middle East.
Okay. Let me focus a little bit on Egypt then. I don't know to what extent you're able to discuss these things, but how do you see the political economy of Egypt going? There's huge inflation going on in the country. There's a huge development in terms of projects, which is nice to see. But the inflation and the prices are skyrocketing. Talk to me about the Egyptian pound.
I mean, inflation is currently getting in control, and as well, the FX is getting relatively under control. I'm not sure if you had the chance to look at the IMF fourth review. There are lots of hope in this review when it comes to inflation, when it comes to growth as well, picking up finally, and when it comes to, and I think this is the most important thing, the buildup of the reserves. Because one of the things that the government was quite obsessing about, I mean, rightly so, is that we're depleting in terms of reserves. And that's one of the reasons that the government was going, hitting here and there in order to create this kind of reserve buildup. We're starting to be on track on that path as well. I think the main challenge is rather the political economy rather than the economy,
Mm.
in the sense that you cannot really think of economics without looking at politics. And a
Mhm.
huge challenge for the Egyptian government today is getting a little bit backwards. Egypt, I mean, since the pharaohs, it's been a state-led society.
Sure.
But now, with the world changing and with the Egyptian positionality within the region, but also within the whole world, becoming more of, I would say, a mediator in terms of infrastructural mediator. You can think of Egypt as a hub for distribution rather than manufacturing and exportation. You can think of Egypt as a hub for tourism, not in the sense of being the final destination, but being, a point between 2 points between Europe and Dubai, for instance.
Buy,
If
for
you
example,
think, if you think of the
or even
that
religious
way.
tourism.
Exactly, religious tourism as well to Saudi, for instance. Egypt could be a very good, for instance, if you think from a tourism perspective, a good transit from one part to another. So Egypt is becoming more and more this kind of mediator in the global economy. However, the state cannot function that way. This is a function that must be played by the middlemen, by actually SMEs rather than even big corporations.
Mm-hmm.
And both SMEs and corporations are having a hard time in competing with a state that is very massive and that is
Yeah.
very engaged in the market. And I think the main challenge for the government today is to balance a politics that needs the states to be strong and solid, that needs a very strong military, given all
It
the
does.
risks that we're involved in, geopolitically, that has a very also independent military, but also that has a military and a state that can hold itself from engaging so far in the economy. Especially here, I'm speaking about the non-strategic markets. So I'm not speaking about, strategic markets where we, understandably, being a 106 million, population, most of which are in under poverty lines, that the state and the military as well needs to, have a foot on the door in order to control prices, control inflation, and control any sort of market failures. But I'm talking about industries that are not as strategic. We're talking about FMCGs, food and beverage, construction and development. These things, the state is trying its best to get out of it, at least relatively, and there are plenty of recent, policies and policy documents that were released. However, it's really struggling on the ground in doing so.
Do you think a good way for them to transition out of it as a state would be through public-private partnerships? So they slowly hand the keys to private individuals. And if so, talk to me a little bit about that.
Well, definitely. The challenge with the PPP is that if there's no balance of power and there's no symmetry of information, it doesn't become so much a PPP, right? Like it needs to be balanced. And if the state is much stronger than, if one P is much stronger than the other, it's not really a partnership. It's more of an acquisition, right? And I think this is where the risk lies, and this is where a very nitty-gritty balance the state needs to do on that front.
I agree with you. It's just that I see Egypt as a country that it's what you said basically. It needs a strong state. It's always had a strong state, and it does need a strong military. So you're just ending up in a black circle going around in circles, right? Because it's understandable that they would want to transition out of it, and they do need to find a way to transition out of it. But the reality is, how can it be done? If a PPP is if you're Sparta dealing with a small little village, right, then it's very hard to get into a PPP. The main counter argument to that is that Turkey, which follows some similar patterns, has succeeded in many PPPs, especially in construction and healthcare. So a similar model could be adapted into Egypt. I just wanted, again, your 2 cents on it.
I mean, it does. There is an opportunity for that. It just needs a very delicate balance. And part of this balance is to control very powerful stakeholders within the government and within the state. And there is also an element, like a third element, given that you referred to Turkey, that played so well in Turkey and currently is also engaging quite actively, or was engaging quite actively in Egypt until a crisis that you can guess occurred. It's the international development. So the international development is the best sector designed to play the role of the mediator between the state and the private sector. But then with the US aid hit and Trump's pullback and the implications of that on trust within SMEs, but also within the government to the whole international development ecosystem, this is becoming more and more challenging. Turkey, the experiment was successful, and a huge part of the success was pushed through international development agencies and international organizations, which today are all around the world quite of shying out given the dryness of finances, but also, more importantly, the kind of disturbance of trust that happened due to what we saw with the US aid.
A small side note into this, and then we'll shift into a different subject. I see Egypt, and I'm looking at it, spending most of my time in Europe. The reality being that it has focused a lot in things like energy, solar development, etc., etc. Uh, is that another segment of this approach? Is it trying to develop itself by being a key energy provider through alternative resources to the world?
Absolutely. I mean, we have all the opportunities in the world. We have a very, very strong sun, right? All the time, all year. We have water from everywhere there is water, whether it's the Nile, the Red Sea, the White Sea, or the Mediterranean Sea. So I think, yes, Egypt is taking really serious steps on that front, whether it's solar energy, hydro energy, or green hydrogen. I think also sustainability. Egypt has proven that it's able to take huge leaps in sustainable production of energy after COP27, and meeting our promises on that front. Again, the challenges remain as they are. It's the structural challenges, inclusive of the mixture of politics and economics, the very, very strong state that sometimes, even if the state seriously, and this happens quite a few times, seriously encourages corporations and SMEs to get engaged, corporations and SMEs have their calculations, and whenever they see that there is a risk that you would end up competing with a very, very strong state in the market, they tend to shy out. So again, I mean, there are structural elements that would touch upon any industry that would look into in Egypt, and unless we take serious steps in alleviating these structural constraints, we wouldn't expect much of leaps.
It sounds to me like what you're saying is basically you need to rip the band-aid off, right? The patient has cancer and you need to treat them aggressively, very aggressively. And I understand. I mean, again, we're going back into circles, and it's going to end up in a dark circle because the state needs to be strong in Egypt, but at the same time, it needs to free the market completely, and it's a very, very tough job for it to be able to handle. So let me move away from that and let me focus a little bit on to the sustainability part that you mentioned. So you do a lot of sustainability rhetoric. You focus a lot with policy and government affairs. What do you see the biggest gap between sustainability rhetoric and sustainability practice in industries or in government?
Well, I think the main thing is that we think of sustainability in terms of climate, right? So sustainability is a question that goes far beyond green. Or green is an issue also that goes much far beyond green, right? I think this is one of the main things that I care to highlight. Like, if we take it from a healthcare perspective, for instance,
Mhm.
one way to do sustainable um, one way to do sustainable healthcare practice is to have sustainable healthcare facilities, right? Healthcare facilities that depend on solar energy, that depend on electric mobility, and so on. But another way is early screening. Like, take it that way. If I knew that the sick patient is sick early on, I could give him the medicine. He could get better, right, early on, and hence the whole spending, whether it's carbon spending or financial spending or societal spending, societal costs, carbon costs, and clinical costs that deems necessary when the sick patient is already, halfway through the stages,
Yeah.
is resolved. You resolve it from the origin, so to speak, right? I can, cut the whole social and environmental and clinical costs very early on through investing in early screening, early diagnosis, and early treatment. And early financing, part of this is also early financing of the treatment. That's one example from healthcare, but you can see it all along plenty of other industries. If I say early screening, I'm not only talking about screening patients, but
Yeah.
screening problems, right? Screening
Yeah.
gaps early on, before before there are costs that you start thinking about how to reduce these costs. You can eliminate these costs from the very beginning if you could track and trace problems, whether they're clinical problems, social problems, and environmental problems early on.
It doesn't sound to me like that is something, well, sometimes not even corporations can achieve doing it early on, but it definitely doesn't sound to me like something as big as a government or any government across the world would be able to screen early on. It's one of those things where you say theory is right, but practice is a little bit trickier. So how do you make that happen?
I think it's just a restructuring of investment. So rather than firefighting investment, structures, especially countries like Egypt that has been firefighting for quite a long time, they tend to internalize this firefighting mentality. Whether it's state budgeting or even corporate budgeting, you always think about, how to resolve problems that are already out there at the beginning of the year where you are, setting your budgets, right? However, we need to balance this firefighting, which is very important as well, with what I would put as early screening, right?
Sure.
Looking at problems while they emerge and resolving them early on. There are plenty of positive campaigns that we see in Egypt today in that front. I would mention, for instance, the anti-smoking campaign and the anti-sugar campaign. These are two things that deals, that would resolve plenty of expenditures. Again, when I say expenditure, I'm not only talking about clinical and financial expenditures, I'm also talking about economic burdens that are created due to, someone leaving his job because he has lung cancer, for instance, or someone becoming less productive because of, cardiovascular diseases that happens from, sugar and smoking consumptions. But I'm also talking about environmental costs. Think of someone with, chronic kidney disease due to consumption of sugar, and the spending that is in dialysis, the spending even the your back and forth trip to the clinic or to the hospital. These are all things that could be easily controlled through massive campaigns. And in Egypt, you have these very popular presidential campaigns, whether it's health campaigns or social campaigns. And I think these are brilliant interventions. So the way President Sisi takes, has his take on this is that simply instead of utilizing a bureaucracy that has been very heavy and rightly so, given that Egypt is a very big and old state, we can, sort of penetrate this bureaucracy through a campaign that is central, administrated by the president himself, and that goes on a national level, screening. And here, screening is not only medical screening, diagnosing, and treating social and economic problems across the nation without having to go through the old and kind of intricate bureaucracy.
I want to take a small pause and I want to comment that for me, I see President Sisi's strategy as very, very successful, not in the micro sense, but very successful in the macro sense. So the man clearly has a 40-year strategy ahead of him, and it seems to be working in the long run, not so much in the short term. The short term is very turbulent, I understand that. But the macro run of it seems to be successful. And this is a fantastic example you mentioned. I would just like to see it across all the boards, right? So across all segments of sustainability. I understand smoking is a huge problem in Egypt, and so is the consumption of sugar. I also understand that back in the day, at least, and it's been a while for me, but back in the day, for example, there was no regulation in the production of cigarettes in Egypt, um, like you have in Europe, where you, for example, you have the maximum amount of nicotine or the maximum amount of tar being this. You didn't have these kind of rules and regulations in Egypt. Do you think that part of the campaign the president is doing should also target creating these rules and regulations, not just for smoking, but across all industries.
Well, absolutely. But again, Egypt is a very complicated
It is.
bureaucracy and a complicated society. Um, so you need to be very sensitive when dealing with setting new laws, setting new regulations. There are plenty of uh, cultural and security elements that you always need to take into consideration. And that's why I think presidential campaigns are a brilliant solution to that, because it just cuts across the clutter and
Yeah.
goes directly to the problem, uh, and try to solve it in a very pragmatic, I wouldn't say ideal, far from ideal, of course, but a quick fix, a quick pragmatic fix could be a good starting point for a broader revisionism that includes, new regulations, new structures, new institutions put in place. A proof of concept, if we speak in, the Gen Z, back to the Gen Z wording.
Yeah. I actually think the private sector could also help a lot in this. For example, I've seen a lot of consultancies come into Egypt, and I know by default that in the region, consultancies focus a lot in innovation and governance in many ways, whether it be digitalization, whether it's running campaigns. I know, for example, that a key consultancy in the region was building the Egyptian cadastry a few years ago from the get-go, from the beginning. So my question to you is shifting a little bit from what we discussed up until now, but what do you think could happen in terms of digital transformation, or what you have seen happen in digital transformation in the public administration in Egypt that you consider a success story, whether it's for the country or for the region?
Well, absolutely. The first thing that one should be very happy with is that we already have systems in place today that encourages digital first, right? So if we think of the digital transformation in Egypt, we need to think of the before and after. We need to think in the sense of historical data that are very, very challenging, right? Because we used to be a paper and pen society and a paper and pen bureaucracy,
Yeah.
and the future. Today, I mean, thanks to innovations like InstaPay, for instance, where most of the payments today are done through phones,
Mm-hmm.
through smartphones, especially in main cities, which means that there is a very good tracking of financial data. Most of the salaries are today, except in informal economies, are passed through credit cards that also feeds into the InstaPay. InstaPay is something very similar to Apple Pay, but it's much user friendly to Egyptians. And all these developments means a future that is digital and a future that has data. The same applies as well to EMRs, electronic medical records. The same applies to birth and death certificates. Before it was paper and pen. But the challenge is that we have a huge society and a huge bureaucracy that has been for years based on paper and pen. The digitalization of historical records is the main challenge. And this is where consultancies, but also international organizations come in handy, because this is a lot of spending. It needs international development support, but once this fixed costs are put in place, it could be so much income generating. Imagine a world where you can capture Egypt, you can capture the Egyptian economy in the same way that you capture the British economy or the German economy. So you can target ads, you can understand when what programs should be implemented, where are the gaps, where are the clinical gaps, where are the socioeconomic gaps, and so on. This would be brilliant to the whole world, not only to Egypt. But this needs a lot of fixed costs, and that's where USAID particularly, and of course the GIZ were coming in handy. But unfortunately, USAID is gone, and the GIZ as well is quite. I mean, they're not gone; they're there, but the trust has been kind of it's becoming quite tricky after the US aid hits.
Two questions regarding this. One is that 106 million with birth rates increasing dramatically sounds like it's going to be a huge infrastructure cost for Egypt to be able to digitalize all of its services. What would be a good way for it to handle it economically? And B is that you have success stories in the UAE or the KSA where digitalization, to a very large extent, has gone fantastically, and they've evolved beyond the basic bureaucracies. Is there something from that model that Egypt could learn and use, not to be so dependent for on GIZ or USAID, for example?
I mean, let's be frank on this. We can't digitalize all services in Egypt. In Egypt, you have more than 50% of the Egyptian economy is informal. Uh, Most of Egypt is under the poverty line. 70% are mal-educated. 30% cannot even read or write. Right. So these are like quick glimpse about the Egyptian society that makes it quite different from the UAE.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of, I mean, working in Egypt, you always hear about the UAE model in everything, but then the comparability is quite complicated. One of the brilliant ways that was driven by GIZ and the Ministry of ICT in Egypt in digitalization is creating hubs, creating digital centers. So we'd go to a rural area where most of them do not have smartphones or have computers, and
Mm-hmm.
then you will just load one computer, load 6, 7 computers in a center with fiber optics, and ask people instead of going all the way to to the to the center, to the
Big city,
Cairo
yeah.
or whatever, just go to the center and they would do the digitalization for you. They will be your face of digital service. This to me is digitalization enough, right? We do not really need to
Fair enough.
digitalize all services in the sense of the UAE, where most of the country has smartphones, most of the country, are financially able and are working in relatively formal economies, right? Uh, in Egypt, it's quite different. What we need and what the UAE and Saudi Arabia could support us with is not the know-how, but it's rather the finances, right? The structural financing, particularly that perhaps Saudi Arabia and the UAE could even make more money from Egypt being digitalized than Germany and the United States, given the proximity, given the same language, and given the integration of the markets. So this is, I think, where they come in handy, rather than the model. Also, another core difference between the UAE and Egypt is that we're a civilization of 7,000 years. I know we always say this in a positive sense, but sometimes it has a draining baggage with it.
Absolutely.
Yes, yes,
Absolutely.
yes.
But
So
go
it's
on,
very
develop
hard
that
to
thought
change
even further.
mentalities in Egypt. It's much easier to do that in a relatively new state
Mm.
like the UAE.
Okay. Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. I was just thinking that, if digitalization was the future and Egypt focused on, again, a 40, 50-year strategy, then potentially could fast track itself, in my eyes, to even potentially surpass the UAE and the KSA. And that's where I think, for example, the UAE and the KSA would not come in and finance Egypt. They might make money out of it, but fast tracking the development of Egypt might not be beneficial for them in the long run, unless it becomes something like a tourist hub as an interim hub for the KSA, for example, or for Dubai. So I also a very, very difficult. I mean, everything in the region is very, very difficult, whether it's something as simple as digitalization or as complicated as making friends and developing further. So how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean it's definitely a complicated region. I think this is shifting a little bit because the core complication of the region, two core complications of the region was oil, right?
Yeah.
So it's an oil hub, which makes it a classical, a hub for classical imperialist interventions, right?
Sure.
And the second thing was, of course, the war, and particularly Israel and Iran as two, I would say, foreigners within the region, right?
Yeah. Fair
So
enough.
if you think of it that way, so these two complexities, one of them is not fading at all. The war aspect, I think it's getting much more complicated. But the
I
oil
agree.
aspect, given the diversification in Saudi Arabia, the major oil producer of the world, the economic diversification, massive economic diversification taking place there, and in the UAE as well, and also in Qatar with gas. Qatar is now also a hub for education, relatively hub for financing and for financial interactions, and of course for tourism. With these things changing, and with the oil becoming less significant, given the other, in the future kind of future energy sources, I think complexity of the region will become less. Imperialist
I
interventions
hope so.
hopefully will become less, and this will give a breathe to the region, and maybe particularly to countries like Egypt, that is not very rich in oil, but it's also still a powerful player within the region.
I hope so, and I mean, I sincerely hope so. I really, really sincerely hope so. The way I've started to understand the region is that it has moved beyond its need for conflict, the clash of its civilization as it was developing, and it's now looking for other ways to be able to sustain itself. And you could see that, for example, with Egypt's foreign policy with Israel or the UAE or the KSA. It has shifted completely its mentality from what it was 50 years ago. And I'm not saying it's a negative. I'm actually considering it a very, very positive in terms of building stability in the region. Um, Now, with imperialist powers coming into the region, and foreign interventions and war. I just hope it's over as fast as possible, and hopefully the countries that consist of the Arab League as a whole will sit down and be able to focus on again a 50-60 year plan on how to develop each country respectively and the region, whether that being an African Union or an Arab Union with a similar model as the EU or something of that sort. That would be for me an ambitious project to see in that area. So I don't know. How do you feel about that?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure about the clash of civilization element. I don't think things are getting any better in the region. Perhaps there is control on the state level.
Yeah.
I mean, we have statesmen that are quite pragmatic all across, and that have very firm and delicate calculations. But on the grassroots, and I'm here not talking only about uh, popular grassroots or civilian grassroots. I'm also talking about security and military grassroots.
No, that's a
Things are
different story.
getting.
I agree.
Yes, yes. We need to always put that in mind for sustainability, for sustainable peace, right? So any talks about sustainable peace needs two things. First, it needs justice, right?
Hmm.
Any sort of peace that is built on one side taking over is not sustainable. Speaking of sustainability, and second, any sustainable peace needs to have the blessing of the grassroots. And this is something that I can definitely testify is definitely not the case.
It's not the case. I agree with you. I was talking about it on a statesman level. You're right. I should have
Yep.
highlighted it. But no, the grassroots is feeling really, really different. Do you are you as ambitious as me about the region? Do you hope to see a European Union of Arab states in the future? One common currency?
I mean, of course, I mean, normatively, I am. positively, I'm not sure how practical this is. As we started the conversation, the Arab world is not really an Arab world, right? We're fragmented on several levels. We're different on so many levels. Egyptians tend to think of themselves as Africans as well. Same for Moroccans, same for Algerians. Some African nations that are also Arab wouldn't tend to think of themselves as, Africans. Some Arab nations are very rich, some are very poor, some are very new societies and new states. Some are very old and traditional. I wouldn't think of the Arab world as one unit. The Arab League is, of course, with all the paralysis that we see within this institution, it's of course a huge development in the history of the Arab world, and I hope that it could, materialize into more concrete collaboration between the Arab states. But throughout the how many years now since '48, we did not see, we did not see that coming for plenty of reasons. Some of them cultural, some of them political, some of them economic, some of them even geographical. In the sense of the demography and how the demography identify itself. So I'm ambitious, of course. I'm hopeful, but I'm, practically speaking, this is
Realistic.
not how I see the region going.
Realistic, yeah. No. The main counter argument to that is that Europe wasn't as unified as it seems
Of course, of
now.
course.
If it could happen here, it could potentially happen there. But I agree with you. I agree with you. Let me shift a little bit because we're running a little bit on time. Let's focus a little bit on the education aspect, right? You've designed multiple master courses in a plethora of institutions. What's that experience like to you? You mentioned in the beginning that it's a little bit harder to adjust to newer students. But what do you think, for example, is one skill that students should develop today to stay relevant in the next 20 years that are focusing on policy?
Oh, that's a very tough question. I would tell you what I'm trying to do. Like, I'm trying to be up to date, and this is proving very, very challenging, right? So trying to follow up on, this is very traditional, I know, but it's, and maybe plenty of Gen Zs wouldn't believe in it, but you need to be on top of the news, right? And this is something that I always tell my students, and I always tell myself as well. You need to be on top of the news. You need to be also deep down into the news and what it means, and the backgrounds and the context within the contexts. The second thing is, of course, being updated on technology. Things are running very, very fast, and if we as policy advisors are not updated on that, we will be irrelevant in a few weeks. I wouldn't say in a few years, right? So you need to always be up to date with technology and how to use this technology. And the third thing is to be powerful in what you as a human can do that an AI cannot. I think this applies to most of the industries, but particularly so within policy. Why? Because for years and years, we as economists, what we were asked to do is models, right? Models, presentations, papers, policy papers. That's what we used to do for a living. And I would hire Alex or hire Hisham because he can read plenty of papers quickly and get me the gist of it.
Yeah.
This, I promise you, ChatGPT would do much better than both of us. So what we can do that ChatGPT cannot do is what we need to think and focus on. And to me, this is the human aspect, in the literal sense. We can feel, right? We can sympathize and empathize. We can criticize and see the world from a critical perspective, look at what's beyond the news and beyond the developments. And I think these are the things that we would have to focus on in the coming few years in order to stay relevant.
It's an interesting intake. Let me ask you this then. How do you balance theory with preparing students for the messy, unpredictable reality of policy in the corporate world? And it is very unpredictable. And the reality is, for example, and I'm looking at a personal experience that, and I see this with Gen Zers as well, that they don't come out of institutions knowing what they're about to deal with. They just sort of learn as they go and they just adapt their own mentality into it. Well, my generation, for example, would have to suppress their mentality into it and sort of adapt into the messiness of that world. So, how do you balance that? How do you balance teaching that?
Well, it's getting harder and harder with time. But one thing that I do, like I've been doing in the past couple of years, and I think I'll do for the rest of my life, given this massive change in the world, that my exams are open book, open ChatGPT, open technology, open text your friend, and it's case based. So here is a case, a real world case that you will see in the real world, and here are the real things that you will use in the real world, and go ahead and see what you're going to do. I think this is the only way that we need to be doing moving forward, because this kind of the policy machine guy is replaced by a literal machine, right? So you don't need to be this guy who knows everything about policy, about concepts, about theory, or can read plenty of texts and analyze it, or can do this brilliant model, because the machine does it much better. You need to be this person that can understand the situation critically, empathize, personalize a story, tell good stories, and this is what case-based exams, and hence case-based teaching as well, in the process of preparation is key.
I remember that, but I have not seen a lot of professors that are willing to do that. Do you think that all educational institutions will have to shift to that eventually?
Yes, 100%. Eventually, I mean, I'm not that old, but I've been through uh, school math teachers that are reluctant to use scientific calculators. So they'll give us the traditional calculators in order for you to be. They thought that this would make your mind, work better, and that scientific calculators simply makes you not learn math, right?
Yeah,
I
you
don't think
become
of
dumber
any
with a
teacher.
scientific calculator. Yes, I remember.
Yes, right. So I don't think of any teacher that would do that today. Eventually, this will happen, and I think it's very important in university and departmental conversations to have to have this transition on board, and to sort of um, be more pushy and compelling in our argument for why this is needed.
Got it. Hesham, we're approaching the end, so I tend to finish with this question, and my question is as follows: if you could give a younger version of yourself some advice on how to go out in the world, or if you had to advise a Gen Zer now, or the generation after the Gen Zers have kind of lost touch. So if you had to advise someone young now going into the world of policy making, what's one piece of advice from your experience that you would give them?
Oh, that's a very hard one. I mean, if I'm looking at my older self, that gets even more complicated. I I think stay relevant, and staying relevant wouldn't happen without mastering the classical, very very classical philosophical aspects of economics and politics. So think about storytelling, think about sympathizing, think about thinking. This is what we're really missing in the economic and political world today: thinking, deep, reflective thoughts. The world doesn't need any more stock phrases. The world doesn't need jargon. It needs critical thinkers. And so encourage yourself to go on that path.
What a fantastic point to finish on. Uh, classical arts, classical philosophy. Hisham, thank you for taking the time to speak to me. I appreciate this. I hope this was pleasant for you as well. and I hope it was pleasant for everybody listening as well.
Thank you very much, Alex. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
All the best.